Good afternoon. We're all ready, aren't we? Good afternoon. Well, I think that before we move on to the content of this talk that brings us here this afternoon, this conversation with Joaquín Araújo, what we need to do is all congratulate ourselves for being here, being able to hold this cultural event with all that it entails. It's an act of resistance almost. I remember when we came out of confinement and went to a play, and the public, the members of the public applauded automatically before the actual event started because there was a cultural event being organized. So I wanted to thank the organization of the Hay Festival for the great effort they have made. It's a kind of romantic effort that they've made in the times that we find ourselves in to celebrate an act with a large number of people present. And then, of course, there are all the advantages that digital technology has to offer us that have helped us a lot throughout the confinement. So it is true that we have triumphed on being successful before we've even begun. So we're here thanks to all of these people to listen to Joaquín Araújo, whose words, I think, have more meaning than ever, because the pandemic has forced us quite unexpectedly and suddenly to look at a new approach and relationship with our surroundings, the natural world. And Mr. Araujo, we could say that the environment is the same, the surroundings are the same, because he is a person who, as you will see through his last book, he's a person, as I say, who has really merged with that environment. He has become part of that medium, that natural environment. With regards to the journalist, disseminator, and enthusiast Joaquín Araújo, we could say that he is a person with a long professional career, and he has held 30 exhibitions and 340 documentaries. There have been lots of radio programs, and he has given many speeches too. And I think that this is season number 38 in Radio Nacional. No, 44. 44. No comments, anyhow. And he has been awarded different prizes, the National Prize for Environment, and he has been the first Spaniard awarded the Global 500 from the United Nations and the World Writers' Award. And though, if we talk about figures, the most surprising thing about the career of Mr. Araujo is the fact that, according to what he says, he has planted more than 25,000 trees. And of course, that's information we had from before the confinement. During confinement, has there been a leap forward in this tree planting exercise as a person who collaborates towards this cause?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for joining this transparency, this brief meetup with culture, with the part that is so forgotten. Thank you also for saying this by way of introduction. We really need to celebrate. Of late, also, those of us who voluntarily live outside this civilization, we've been able to realize that people who live in the field of culture have had to take the limelight and just call out, because they are really on the margin of what's happening. They're being ostracized. And there is a slogan that says, without culture, there is no future. And that really springs to mind. But let me just add, without culture and without nature, that is, it would seem that with this civilization, this model of living that we use that really does away with everything. We do live actually without living. We're not passing on what needs to be passed on, the different strands of human knowledge and wisdom. So it's only opportune that we talk about nature. In a place like this, I must say that you are already in the forest. We will be talking about a book, about a trajectory that is depicted in the book, and I do define myself as somebody who is entangled in the forest. I am a forest entangled person that rides, or a farmer who lives within the forest, because we're living times where forests are ever more important. Forests used to be sacred. The first temple didn't have a roof, did have columns. The trees, the tree trunks, actually, that acted as columns, and the columns that you see around us that are the pillars that sustain this building, they are derived from that original kind of column. Even here, where we seem to be further removed from nature, monotheism actually did away with the links with nature. Well, monotheism forgot that these columns evoke the trees, the forest. So let me just circle back to your question. We have decided to live far away. My first neighbor is to be found at a distance of 15 kilometers. And I do spend a very high percentage of my time in total solitude. And it's absolutely normal in my case that I spend weeks and weeks without meeting up with another one of my species, another human being. So this meeting with silence or with language of spontaneity does communicate fascinating things, even if you don't use words for that. And logically, you end up reflecting a lot about what we do with our current world. But that wasn't usual for people. I'm going to be very blunt, because the lifestyle prefers noise to music, and pollution, what is not transparent, what is gray, to something that is light and transparent, and would rather be confined than in a freedom. But these situations have been kind of turned upside down. The human being ends up doing the opposite of what we would prefer, like Albert Camus would say. Humans are the only living being that destroys what they love. But now with the pandemic, we've had time to rethink things. An important part of people are trying to philosophize, to think, which is philosophy at the end of the day. And as has been proven quite clearly, another type of life is possible. Suddenly, this became apparent, and we all have reflected and have realized that health comes first. You need to keep healthy. And then comes something which is also very, very important. The others and the other things, that is everything natural, everything human, is valuable. So the person that tends to the sick in hospitals, everyone who keeps the machinery in the food industry, every human being who makes sure that survival is possible in our society becomes key. In nature, this is quite obvious, but when you live far removed from nature, this is something that voluntarily is despised, and thus we turn to become aggressive with these elements. There are disquieting symptoms that point to the following. Contrary to what we might have thought 3 months ago, a relaxation is taking place. We need to prioritize what we breathe. We're living a pandemic that affects directly our breathing. So the time had come to think, but before the pandemic in Spain, due to the air pollution, 16,000 people would die, and 6 million people, that would be the death toll worldwide. So there is this virus of our comfort. If you renounce a given amount of comfort, we don't need to pollute that much. So, summing up, this is a great opportunity to realign the priorities of the essential.
In fact, this book that was published by the publishing house was a book that unfortunately came up just before confinement, and this is why it deserves a second opportunity. And I think that people are giving you that second opportunity because I saw the label of second publication.
Yes, very surprising that this would be possible in this very brief period.
In fact, I said that in this book there are some quotes from Miguel Delibes and one from Cioran, who stops the world through negligence. And you get the feeling that from the point of view that you mentioned, the environmental point of view, that the world had been stopped. But those cities that allowed for the bushes to grow up and for there to be exuberant vegetation, vote against the concrete in cities, that was allowed to begin with. But now they're cutting back on things, and we're going back to a phase before this stop. The harm that we are afflicting against nature.
Quite right. You've cited two crucial ideas. Yesterday, I was honored with a book that the National Library has dedicated to Goitisolo and I've been able to Miguel Delibes, that is, and I'm honored. So Miguel Delibes triggers emotion in his speech, and he says, if this is going to go on like this, please stop the world, because this is not working. Cioran is really heart-rendingly lucid. You need to realize this aphorism. To stop the world, either because of an error or just by chance, that will be the solution. And that's the problem. We are destroying by inertia. To maintain life as a whole, and our water and our air demands to say stop, to say so far and not any further. If the collapse of our health system allows a rethinking of society, then we should do the very same vis-à-vis the possible collapse of the climate. Let's just stop the world. Let's stop using energy. Let's consume less energy and resources. To stop in order to save. yourself to stop in order not to crash, because we're really speeding much too much. That is incredibly lucid, incredibly intelligent, and it needs to be applied immediately. And right now, we're seeing that things move in the opposite direction. Everything related to climate from December to March, there had never been so many people taking decisions in order to try to protect and to save the world.
In fact, I remember the economic crisis of 2008, that in the media, the feminist revolution and the fight against climate change was high up on the agenda, and they were in the end pushed aside, and a long time went past before these things became headlines again, and probably the same will happen.
But we're trying to exert pressure now, and a lot. Now we do have this climate change agenda. Let's see whether this pastry that's already in the oven really evolves as it does.
There's another aspect in the book that's very linked, very much has to do with this, and which I think is very relevant, and I think I should quote it. At the beginning of the book, you explain that the forest is ill, but that at the same time we need to recover it because it looks after us. And so I think about our health workers, people who look after us, but at the same time they have become ill, that because of a lack of resources or because we haven't given them the necessary protective equipment for them to carry out their work, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. What's your opinion?
Well, we should think up a word, because this is a fascinating metaphorical parallelism. So I am an enthusiastic believer in trees. Trees are absolutely important to me, and trees and the forest are the best that the story of life has given to life as a whole. By far, nothing has ever been that as important, as opportune, as generous, so important for the health of this planet as forests, as trees. If we had enough trees, our fight against climate change and global warming would be much easier. It's already something that is clearly visible on the horizon. It's not just looming on the horizon. So the forest is the vaccine against climate change, and that's very lucky. I mean, we don't have a vaccine for COVID-19, but we do have a vaccine for climate change. So how wonderful. We do have a treatment. We do have a drug for that. We need to know how to apply the drug. But the problem is that there is another metaphor. It is a sick drug. Because look at the trees. There are various plagues and pathogens, even viral pathogens, that are killing trees. And look at the wildfires. Last year, the planet has lost as many trees as the totality of the trees that still give shade in Spain. 17 billion trees less due to wildfires last year, all in all. But, as I said, there is room for hope. But I go back to what you said, to what you suggested. It's wonderful. We have a great healthcare system to face up to the pandemic. But at a point in time, I think 25, 26% of the healthcare professionals fell ill at a time where they were most needed. So this leads me to think deeper. You can see parallels here between what happens to civilization and to nature. And it has to do with the continuity of our life to health at the end of the day. We want people to tend us if we fall sick, but the air is sick and we need to tend to the air.
I remember something I read when I was young called the rampant stop of Italo Vitano, and he described the tops of trees and he didn't want to come down to earth. How would that person find himself in the current Spain? There are 7,500 million, 17,000.
No, forest catalogs are complex, but 17 billion trees at a minimum.
But do you think we'd have to double that amount?
Yes, we need double that amount. We've lost 30% of forests worldwide during the industrial period of humanity. So that's an incredible catastrophe. You might say that every day we lose 10 million forests in one day, and in sometimes even 2 million trees. So the book you referred to might seem a paradox, but probably he would live better in Spain today than 100 and even 200 years ago, because in Spain we've added about 3 million hectares of well, we can't say forest surface, but we're adding shrubbery and young trees. Problem is that we have totally abandoned the rural areas. The rural culture has been actually massacred. Nobody has cared for it, and there has been so much social and economic unfairness that rural Spain has been emptied. So now we have more trees, more than over a long stretch of time during our history, if we look back. But this baron who used to go from one tree to another would have had to face up, for example, to wildfires in Ourense of late in Galicia. And, for example, the problem that did away with the elm trees in Spain, and the Quercus uber and other forests and other trees in Spain are suffering. And at some point in time, this character would end up grabbing a dead tree.
In any case, those of us in this room, if we were to plant the same number of trees as you did, we would gain something. Perhaps you could explain the story of your forest to people. You live in a forest that you yourself haven't necessarily built, but you inspired it.
I've planted 25,000 trees myself with my hands. I have fostered direct projects that were approved that encompass 2.5 million more trees, but that are not, these trees I have not planted myself. But history is very simple.
It's not only just as a lover of higher manifestation of life, the forest itself, but also being committed to the better side of human beings, the need to be grateful, that is. And the day I decided to plant trees more seriously, I mean, I had planted trees on a one-off basis, but it was the day when my book was published, my book number 40 was published. And I thought, well, if my book is being published, then can I say what number we're at now? 111. But when I was at number 40, I said, well, if I'm being published, if my books are being published of mine, then I have to plant trees because the forest has published all those books. So that's the dedication in book number 40. The dedication is to the forest that has published all these books. So, of course, I said, it will be necessary to plant trees. And I started by planting 1,000 trees per year. And it didn't cost me any money because the government from Extremadura would give them to me as a gift because it knew that I was going to plant them, many of them in public spaces and land, in areas surrounding my land. And there came a time when something happened. I have to summarize a great deal because otherwise we'd be here till tomorrow. But there came a time when I decided that the tribute that had to be paid to those people who were leaving us and was that on dying, on passing away, so many trees had to be planted for the number of years they'd lived. It was a symbolic type action. If somebody is born, it's easy to plant a tree, and that's a cultural tradition that is very common in many places of the world. So why not plant so many trees as the years that person has lived when that person passes away? And that's what happened. My father died, and I planted 86 trees. Miquel Delibes passed away, and I also planted, I think it was 86 or 87 trees. My father died at the same age as Miquel Delibes, and La Gordeta passed away, and I planted 70-something trees too. Antonio Fraguas Forges passed away, a great friend that I was fortunate enough to do many things with, and I published a book together with him, and I planted the number of trees as the years he had lived. And the same happened with many people, some of which were martyrs of the forest, because there are many people in this world who have passed away from defending trees. They have been killed, environmental champions. But when my mother died, I was planting 90 trees in memory of my mother, and I suffered from legitimate ambition or greed, unjustified to a certain extent. I thought, how miserable of me that I'm only planting 1 tree per year lived. And so I thought, well, I started speculating and thought, well, why don't we plant as many trees as the days lived by my loved ones? And I did a calculation, and I thought if everybody were to plant trees for every loved one who died, it could offset the loss to a certain extent. But also what came to mind was thinking about my own death. And I said, and how many trees will my son have to plant when I pass away? So I did a quick calculation, and it turned out that if I had died right then and there, when I was planting 90 trees for the death of my mother, at that time, I had lived 24,500 days, 24,100 something days, and I planted 24,000 trees. So I had a moment of fury, and I thought, well, I've got a tree for every day lived, 25,000 something, and I've lived more than 25,000 something days, and I've planted 25,000 trees. Amongst many other things, there's something that surprised me and I found fascinating in your book, and that is when you explain the world of roots, the depth and the interrelationship between trees. And you suggest that, in fact, the roots are a true social network. Well, yes, I think we kind of imagined that. We knew that intuitively. It appeared in some verses, in fact, Chinese poetry from the past. And it's very interesting, the capacity to be able to anticipate science that poetry has had in poetry from all times. But then the neurobiologists came along, who are now greatly fashionable. And they have discovered that, in fact, trees are connected. They send information to each other. They take decisions jointly to a certain extent by means of their roots. And it's practically impossible to prove, of course, because there are teams of botanists who quite literally are able to uncover all the roots and see with what they connect and where. But it is speculated anyway that there is speculation that apart from chronic situations, there are trees that are a single individual, even though you see 100 trunks or 100,000 trunks. It's one single living being. And we speculate with the idea that an Atlantic forest, for example, there maybe all the trees are connected to each other, and it's quite fascinating, this idea. And the interesting thing is that this is done through a postal system, through intermediation, the bacteria basically in this case, and there are living things that live symbiotically with the leaves, and there is molecules involved, and all of them are in contact. So one has to challenge the supremacy of human beings. And I say this in my book, and I'm very happy to have done so, because I believe that the root system of a forest is far superior than internet, far superior to internet in terms of the amount of information that is circulating out there. There's another matter. I'd like to ask you, have you scaled and gone up many trees? Yes, and as an ornithologist that I was for a good many years, I spent a long time studying birds, and in fact I specialized in that, in going up trees, climbing trees with a ladder. And I've climbed trees as well without a ladder, but I'm just going to show off a minute. I still climb trees. You talk about the teachings or the learnings that a child might get from climbing up trees, but current society doesn't consider that as being useful. We want to minimize risks at all costs. We have built artificial trees with foam below so that children won't hurt themselves if they fall down, because otherwise who would you report? What is your opinion of this evolution? Have we really made things worse? Well, climbing up trees and amongst the branches is a very positive thing, amongst other things, because the branches inspire one. I like to say something about a poem of a single verse, which is in the book. Trees are always waiting for us with open branches or open arms. So, of course, one should climb up those trees and hug those trees and climb around those trees, and in the branches, because that is the idea of not making things concrete. And that is extremely important in life, to not want to end things or conclude things. That is the spirit. That is the great skill and wisdom that nature has. We are very finalist in nature. We have kind of like coined a brand, and that is that we should be successful in our projects. We have to culminate things and finish things. No, that isn't the case. Life should not see things finished. And if you are finished, then there should be something that continues after you. And that is this idea that is evoked in scrambling around the branches. There's nothing more important than wasting a lot of time in scrambling around the branches, precisely to ensure that life doesn't end. You give a detailed description of the enjoyment of living and merging in the slowness of life in forests. How does this fit in your opinion, with the increase of the use of mountains to carry out sport, to practice sport, which accelerate? I'm talking about races in the mountains, which are becoming increasingly fashionable. Well, one of the main problems with this arrogant species, the human species, is this Olympic ideal. I think there's nothing more stupid than being the tallest, the fastest, and the strongest. And I think being in a hurry is really destructive, and it's destroying nature. Being in a hurry destroys the most important things. And I need to quote my colleague from so many programs who maintains that being in a hurry destroys care and understanding. Care and understanding. Because what is as important as those two things? But to a certain extent, running in the forest brings us back to our origins. No, but one shouldn't run through nature or the forest. And in fact, there was an hour program on the radio on being slow, doing things slowly. There's nothing more important than being slow and moving slowly. Because, in fact, speed itself induces a lack of a sensitivity towards what is destroying that speed. And one can add two things to that. Forests are the places where there is the least hurrying on this planet. But when you come in touch with other realities in the world, spontaneous and beating world, absolutely nobody in nature, not the cycle, the process, or the symbiosis, or the species, or the timescales of life itself, there's never any hurrying there. There's no living being, except for the human beings, who want to end things before time, or to end sooner. Time is a perfect dose. Things have their own time to them, and we are accelerators of some processes because of pollution, for example, and many other things. And these are devastating for nature and for other species. Hurrying is the biggest stupidity out. Have we become insensitive to environmental tragedies such as the continuous deforestation of the Amazon forest, forest fires, and often these things take place far from us? But the other day they said that the smoke from the fires in California had reached Mallorca, so we're in a world where one can no longer say there's that distance. Perhaps I should make a clarification here. After half a century of environmental journalism and NGOs that have become many more since then, this attempt at awareness raising and these small drops of knowledge that are given in the educational system, but very small drops, as I say, one could say that most of humanity does know that the essential things are being destroyed. It is known. It is a known fact. We have realized that this is not something that is hidden from us now. So it's good. It's just and necessary that that be the case. And that is the work of millions of people who, from the professional field and militancy, and altruistic and risky work that is carried out, and it is there for us. But knowing that the world is being destroyed is there. But this matter has been parked. We'll take measures later on. We'll try and solve that when this other matter has been solved, for example. And so the problem lies, and I'm going to contradict myself now, but hopefully you'll be able to understand me. If there's one thing that we should hurry for, if there's something we should do as soon as possible, is we need to cure ourselves. Speed is only good in order to heal ourselves exclusively. If something's hurting, it's wonderful if somebody can come along and take that pain away from you. And this is what we have to do with nature. And of course, that is where I believe we are still far from that awareness, which I think does exist, will become transformed into significant changes in lifestyles and legislation, changes in legislation and changes in the government. We're very far from that still. You as a journalist, what opinion do you have in terms of environmental journalism that is done now? You'll agree that there are some media where there is no position for the environmental journalist nowadays. Well, they appear and disappear over time. We've had ups and downs over time in the last 50 years. And furthermore, I mentioned this before, times have never been better than the last quarter of last year and the first quarter of this year, because it seemed that we were truly going in the right direction and that solutions were going to be adopted. Environmental journalism has improved a great deal in the world and in our country, a great deal. There are more environmental journalists, better prepared, information is more professional, more rigorous. And the question is, what percentage of the information do they take up? We have to differentiate between these things because it's not a question of the news on the environment having the same classification as political news, which represents 30 to 40% of all news in total. That really is taking things over. It's really unjust, that weighting, because it would seem that everything is all about knowing what's going on with the politicians and not with politics. The thing is that we're okay, especially in comparative terms, but I think that it is necessary for all these so-called consequences of the confinement and quarantine that we're going to adopt a new lifestyle, that we're going to look for solutions, the green economy, for example. And there are whole countries, in fact, that are truly moving in that direction. And this happens because in all fields, there are good professionals out there who are actively environmentalists. Not only journalists, there have to be firemen, there have to be policemen, there have to be people in different municipalities, and there need to be environmentally aware people everywhere. And it's the same as what's happening with our health. We want there to be more doctors, more nurses, and more cleaning ladies at the moment, or cleaning men. There are very few cleaning men, by the way. But the same happens here. There need to be healers of the environment urgently. And one important thing also, as I say, has to do with these environmental journalists. What I found striking in your book is this request or invitation to us to reconsider the masculine condition that is given to trees and forests. You suggest the idea of a female tree, a tree being female. Well, yes, that is just a slight touch of humor. You see a tree, and obviously it is a woman. I mean, there's no logic in it being given a male gender. Why? Well, everything that is concentrated in the female condition, in the good sense of the word, is shared by trees. And above all, what we could call caring, the world of caring, and everything to do with the world of care. The verse of Walt Whitman, which is difficult to forget because it also anticipates what botanists have ended up discovering themselves. The forests are shapes and species not only there for themselves, but for everything else on Earth. They are matriarchal in nature. And of course, Miguel de Unamuno got it quite right when he said in an article, it wasn't in a poem, when he talked about the matriarchal oaks, evergreen oaks. I mean, it's impossible to describe it any better than that. Those robust matriarchal evergreen oaks. There's one last chapter that I'm not going to talk about because people need to be able to read the book without knowing the end of the book, but it goes along the lines of associating trees with the rest that comes after death. And in fact, you had designed a cemetery or the surrounding areas of cemeteries. Yes, I was fortunate enough to have carried out lots of different professional activities, and fortunately, I was able to diversify as I'm a generalist, because becoming specialist in things is something very wrong with civilization today. Specialist, well, I mean, you're a specialist and you know nothing about almost everything. It's a crazy idea. So the day I was asked to design cemeteries, I said, wow, that's all I needed. After having done loads of things, different things, I thought that's really the last thing I could do, to design cemeteries. And why? Well, because somebody read an article, somebody from the funeral sector, professional in Spain, read an article that I dedicated to my niece, Valeria, the eldest sister of my oldest brother. Lost when she was 4. It was a tragedy, and we placed her amongst the roots of a tree that was in property of mine in Extremadura. And my decision to do that wasn't original in any way. I mean, there are whole cultures that bury their dead amongst trees, and there's this vocation to do so. And now there are cemeteries with no trees in Western Europe. But I explained all the advantages of loved ones resting amongst the roots of trees. And of course, they called me up, and I was hired by a funeral company to carry out a process which I think will become more consolidated and become more generalized in our country. And in addition, it's part of the therapy to restore the air and to heal the air. All our loved ones should be buried amongst trees, and in a spontaneous, natural manner, with no cement or niches or tombstones. Just have a little label saying there's family such and such laid to rest, and that's what I'm involved in. Obviously, us paying tribute to those who have left us by burying them amongst the trees, I think it's very timely. And it kind of like dilutes the dramatic thought about death that we have. I think that we should close this event with a reading, because there's this side of Joaquín Araújo as a poet that we haven't spoken about. Perhaps you could read one of your poems. And before reading it, I'd like to invite people, now that we are at a university, I'd like to close this event with a recommendation that the author makes in his book, and that is that schools and universities, apart from having libraries, what they should also do is plant trees. So students should be invited to plant trees at the same time as they are invited to read those books that are published, as you said, by the trees themselves. Go ahead. Well, it'll be a pleasure, because poetry in somewhere as poetic as Segovia itself, and in this place that has been recovered by culture, in this symbolic forest where we find ourselves. So there is a poet that sums up everything that the book suggests and talks about. Why do I plant trees? I plant trees so that when I'm no longer here, they can be the suppliers of all breaths, the poisons of fresh times, and there are birds that nest, and I plant trees so that when I'm no longer here, the color of life will remain, drawing new landscapes that are calm. I plant trees so that when I'm no longer here, there will be flowers and fruit. And I plant trees so that when I'm no longer here, paper books will continue to exist and eyes that can read them. I plant trees so that when I'm no longer here, the green can sow the rest of the shadows. I plant trees for the grandchildren of my grandchildren, so that when future comes along, they will be grateful for our past through the sap that comes from a forest of memories. I plant trees so that when you are here, beauty will still be beautiful. And I plant trees so that when I'm no longer here, it will be at last possible to see transparency, so that the biggest truth will become true, which is green. I plant trees therefore, so that death will be less deathly. Thank you, Joaquín.
¿Pueden preguntar o no? ¿Hay preguntas o no?
Sí, estamos. ¿Quieres decir algo? Ya estamos.
No, sí.
Buenas tardes. El señor Araujo estará a su disposición para firmar.
Hello. Books will be signed at the exit.